Anna's cheek pressed against the splintered slat of the wagon, her body trembling as if the rough wood could anchor her while the world slipped away. The wagon wheels groaned, creaking mournfully against the rutted dirt, each turn dragging Grace Sullivan farther from the only life she'd ever known. She watched, heart aching, as the Sisters of Mercy orphanage faded into a hazy smear of adobe and shattered hope. For a fleeting moment, the past flooded back, vivid with smell and memory. Boiled starch, candle wax, the thin, steady murmur of prayers, 20 years of whispered benedictions, threadbare gowns, and darned stockings dissolved like smoke in the hot, unforgiving air. "Sit proper, girl." Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, as voice cracked across the bench, sharp and biting as a snapped rhyme. Her eyes glinted with iron cruelty. She'd paid $30 silver for Grace's papers, and she wielded that coin like a second law. "You ain't no charity case no more. You, her merchandise?" She spat, her tone venomous. "Damaged goods dawn, fetch a good price." Grace straightened, wincing as the wagon jolted, her fingers folding into her lap so tightly her nails whitened with fear. The other girls, 3 pale, frightened faces, kept their gazes low, their silence heavy with dread. They knew Mrs. Blackwood, as riding crop, was no mere prop. It taught lessons with leather and a stinging bite. The sun beat down with merciless cruelty, painting everything redder, dust settling on collar and sleeves, on lashes, and in the corners of mouths where girls dared to breathe. The land unfurled in an empty, indifferent roll-twisted mesquite, brittle brush, stones shimmering in the heat like scattered coins. Above them, vultures drifted, patient and inevitable, their shadows a quiet menace. On the second day, they rolled past a burned-out homestead, charred skeleton timbers stark against the horizon. A porcelain doll lay half-buried in the dust, its painted smile crazed and ruined by the relentless sun. Grace stared, her chest tightening with unease, until Mrs. Blackwood, as voice cut through, harsh and warning, "That is what happens to folk who think they were better than their place," she hissed. "Keep that in your head when you get where you're going." The words sank into Grace as bones, cold and heavy. She had been sold as a household companion to some rancher near the New Mexico border, the whispers said. The younger girls traded darker tales, their voices trembling. Saloons, curtained rooms, hands that were not gentle. Grace had learned at the orphanage how to watch, which sisters were coming, which visitors might slip a coin, what corners were safe to cry in. Watching had kept her alive. Watching would keep her now. They stopped on the 4th day at a trading post, where whiskey and sweat hung thick in the stifling air. Through a streaked window, Grace glimpsed a card game, a man with silver conchos palmed an ace and winked, his grin dripping with sin. She turned away, heart pounding. "Keep your eyes down," the smallest girl murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Miss Blackwood donned like us looking at men. "Gives ideas." Grace obeyed, fear tightening her throat. But she did not stop watching, only the angle changed. The road grew wilder as the wagon pushed north. Red Rock spires stood like silent guards. Rattlesnake warmed on stones, and a mountain lion traced the ridge at dusk until the dark swallowed it whole. Each night tightened Grace's chest. Each mile hollowed out what little comfort she'd carried. On the 6th night, camped by a thin creek, Mrs. Blackwood tore meat from a rabbit bone with a sneer, and spoke the name that would mark Grace as fate. "Elijah Monroe," she said, her voice flat and cold. "Lives up in the foothills 15 miles from town. Used to be some kind of gunman, shot up years back. Legs near useless. He's paid. I've got girls to move. Simple. Why would he want me?" Grace whispered, her voice fragile with dread. Mrs. Blackwood laughed, a cruel, barking sound that dismissed the question like a fly. "Why does any man want a woman? He's got coin. I've got stock. That's all there is to it. But word is, Monroe sent the last 2 back, said they didn't suit. You better suit, girl, or you will be working the saloons in El Paso before the month's out." Her words landed like a slap. Grace swallowed hard, the word saloon conjuring 1,000 dark images: tight, curtained room, flickering candlelight, the sour stench of stale beer, and the ache of too many hands. She had steeled herself for roughness. She had not prepared for the weight of being counted like a thing. The final stretch narrowed to a deer path between pines and granite boulders. The air sharpened, biting at lungs unused to the thin, cold bite. As shadows stretched, they crested a rise, and below, tucked into a dip, was a cabin, rough-hewn logs, a leaning barn, a stone chimney, a corral with 2 weary horses. It looked less like a home and more like a place where quiet had come to linger, weary and worn. "This is it," Mrs. Blackwood declared, her voice clipped with finality. Thunder rolled and fat raindrops began to fall, heavy and cold. She pounded the door. "Monroe." "It's Henrietta Blackwood. I've brought your girl." And for a long, tense moment, there was only the patter of rain. Then the door creaked open, slow and reluctant. Elijah Monroe stood there, tall and bent, leaning heavily on a carved walking stick. Dark hair framed his jaw. A deep scar sliced from temple to cheek, raw and telling. He wore plain flannel, patched trousers, cracked boots. His hands had the steady surety of a man who had spent his life with reins and rope. His eyes, gray as a winter dawn, carried a heavy weight of man's unspoken burdens. "She'll do," he said, his voice low and rough as gravel. Money clinked. Grace S. value counted and paid in cold silver. The wagon rattled away, the other girls, pale faces pressed to the glass like ghosts, their eyes wide with pity and fear. Grace stood alone in the rain-soaked yard, shivering, her heart pounding. Monroe turned and hauled himself inside, leaving the door yawning open. Invitation or command, she could not tell. Inside the cabin, the hearth dominated the room, its stones black with years of a man's fire. A rocking chair sat unused by the window. Shelves sagged beneath books more than Grace had ever seen outside the orphanage. 2 doors branched off the main room. Monroe pointed to one, his gesture curt. "That's yours. You'll sleep there. I'll not have you in my bed," he said, his tone firm, almost offensive. Grace blinked, startled. "Sir?" she asked, her voice small. "I said you have your own room," he repeated, jaw tight with resolve. "I need someone to cook, clean, tend the horses when my leg gives." "That's it." "I didn't ask for obedience. I did ask for a woman to warm my bed. I asked for work." He turned away, his voice softer but no less certain. "Get dry, kindling, as by the hearth. I won. Have you sick your first night." The door closed with a soft, final click. Alone, rain dripping from her skirts onto the worn floor, Grace let tears come not from fear alone, but from the dizzy uncertainty of mercy. She had braced for brutality. She had not prepared for the strange, small gentleness that lingered like a soft shadow in the corners. Lightning flashed, and in its brief glow, she saw dust on the rocking chair, the careful order of a man holding himself together by habit more than hope. Morning broke with a rooster, a sharp, piercing cry. Grace woke stiff and cold. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and iron, heavy with solitude. Elijah was already at the hearth, feeding the fire with slow, deliberate motions that favored his bad leg, his face tight with suppressed pain. He did look at her. "I can do that," she offered, her voice tentative but steady. He paused, his eyes flicking to her, then stepped aside without a word. She knelt and coaxed the flames until they took hold. Her hands steady despite the weight of his gaze, quiet, careful, assessing. "Coffee S in the tin. Bacon S in the cold box. Hens should have eggs," he said, his voice rougher than his movements, as if unaccustomed to speech. It was more than he said the night before. Grace nodded and set herself to the small tasks. A lame-footed hen, a loaf with a sour edge, beans to soak. When the skillet sang, her hands steadied, finding purpose. They ate in a silence punctuated only by the clink of cutlery, the weight of unspoken things heavy between them. Elijah cleared his plate without thanks. "I'll be in the barn. Horse with a split hoof needs tending," he said, rising with the help of his stick, his movements stiff with pain. "Shouldn't to you." Grace began, then stopped, her breath catching. His eyes snapped to her, a quick flare of something sharp and bitter. "Should I?" he repeated, his voice laced with defiance. "Maybe not. But horses don't wait for my comfort. Neither does this place." He left, the door thudding behind him, a sound heavy with finality. Work steadied Grace. She scrubbed, swept, tended hens, her hands finding rhythm in necessity. Through the window, she watched him with a mix of fascination and pity. Slow, deliberate, his hands weathered and sure as they calmed a skittish mare. He moved like a man born to ride, but trapped in a body that had betrayed him, his face etched with quiet resolve. The first week braided itself into a careful routine. Dawn tasks dulled the worry that spun at the edges of her mind. Elijah worked until exhaustion left his face gray and tight. They spoke in necessity only, yet Grace learned him the way he liked coffee strong and black, how his shirts were folded with a pride he did not admit, how at night he read cheap pamphlets, dog-eared Shakespeare by lamplight, his face softening in the glow. Snow came on the 10th day, dusting the hills white, a quiet shroud. Grace found him pitching hay in the barn, despite his pain. His knee would buckle, and he would push on, stubborn and unyielding. "Let me," she said, grabbing a pitchfork, her voice firm with determination. "You ever pitched hay?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "No, but I'll learn," she replied, resolute. He watched a beat, then handed her the fork, his movements grudging but accepting. "Keep your back straight. Use your legs. Watch that mare she bites when she is hungry," he instructed, his voice gruff but not unkind. It was harder than Grace imagined. Muscles burned, breath came ragged in the cold air. Yet she kept on, her determination fierce. They worked side by side, breaths steaming, until sweat flung cold on their skin, a shared labor binding them in silence. Days of wine and white pressed the world into a small, livable cage. On the 3rd day of the storm, Grace found him on the floor of his room, face twisted with agony, his breath shallow. He told her to stay back, his voice sharp with pride. She knelt anyway, sliding an arm under his shoulders, dragging him toward the bed with quiet strength. He grunted, cursed, and then the fever came hot and wild, consuming him. She sat up through the night, with cool cloths at his brow, cupped to his lips, whispering steady, soothing words he could not hear. At dawn, the fever broke. He opened his eyes to find her asleep in the chair, her hand still warm on his sleeve. A quiet testament to her vigil. "You stayed," he said thickly, his voice raw with surprise. "Someone had to," she answered, her tone soft but unwavering. He met her with something softer than she'd seen in him, a flicker of gratitude in his gray eyes. "Thank you, Grace," he said, her name leaving his lips as if surprised at how real it sounded, how much it carried. After that night, things shifted. The silence between them was no longer an insulated wall. It had ache and possibility woven through, fragile but alive. Snow melted slow. Drips from the eaves marked the thaw. A quiet rhythm. The world outside glistened new, and inside the cabin something else was waking, tentative and unspoken. Elijah taught her to shoot, his voice patient but firm. He gave her his old Navy Colt and showed her how to breathe, how to aim, how not to fear the recoil. Her first shot sprayed wide, spooking hens and echoing down the valley, but his approval quiet, rare, wrapped her like a borrowed coat, warm and unfamiliar. By the week's end, she could hit 3 tin cans out of 5. He nodded, pride tucked behind his gray eyes, a silent acknowledgement. They worked in rhythm, water fetching, wood chopping, mending fence. Grace learned to read his grimaces, and the way his hand tightened on the cane. On bad days, she took his chores without a word, her movements steady with care. On good days, they moved together like two people rediscovering how to be less alone, their actions a quiet dance. Spring painted the hills with lupine and paintbrush, vibrant and alive. Grace filled jars with flowers and set them on the table. Their color seeped into the cabin, as shadows, softening the edges. One evening, as she arranged blooms, Elijah spoke of Maria fiancée, gone, or pushed away his words like a closed gate creaking open, heavy with regret. He admitted choices he'd made, each one a step away from regret and back towards something like confession, his voice low and aching. "I sent the others back not because they did suit," he said in an ache-laden half-whisper, "but because I thought it safer to be alone than to risk wanting what I could not have." His voice broke, raw with vulnerability. Her heart pounded so loud she feared he would hear it. "You, Don, have to be alone," she said, her voice trembling with courage. He stepped forward, then away, the habit of distance older than his want. "I don't want obedience. I don't want a woman bought with silver," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "I want you, Grace, only you, but not like this, not until you choose it." His fingers brushed hers. The touch was the most dangerous, electric thing she'd ever known. Grace realized then that she had choice, a small, incandescent, terrifying freedom. And more than anything, she feared the shape of that choice, its weight and its promise. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Your support keeps stories like this alive. They sat later that night, cards laid out between them, the air warm with possibility. He taught her to read the tells in a hand. She learned to bluff without flinching, her eyes bright with mischief. Laughter came soft and cautious, and with it, a kind of trust, fragile but growing. He told her of the war, of a brother he failed to save, his voice thick with old grief. She told him of the orphanage bells, their chime a constant in her lonely years. They traded pieces of themselves until the room felt less hollow, and more like a place two people might live together. Time, as it always does, braided pain and small mercies together. One afternoon, Elijah drew her close, his voice steady but soft. "Come to me when you know it. It's what you want, not what you think I need," he said, his scarred face open, scared, and strangely hopeful. Grace held his hand then, and for the first time in her life she felt the hot, dizzy rightness of being chosen freely, not bought. The world beyond the corral remained wide and dangerous, but inside the cabin, a different truth warmed like fresh-baked bread, the truth that a life could be remade from small, steady choices. Don't forget, subscribe, like, and comment to let us know you want more. Your words matter. The thaw came, and the colt nuzzled her palm, warm and trusting. The future, once sold and accounted for in silver, stretched instead like an open road, uncertain, long, full of wind. Grace stepped to the fence and watched the hills, her heart steady, feeling, finally, that she might choose which path to take.